ask for a second. Good morning. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our National Council on US-Libya Relations webinar, Libya, Ukraine, NATO, and the Global Enduring Disorder. Libya and its continuous dysfunction is a key challenge not only for the Libyans, but also its regional neighbors and the international community. The eternal question is always, is there a way out of the current chaos? And what can we learn from Libya with regard to the other crisis area? What can we take lessons from Libya for the current ongoing global enduring disorder? All this situation, the current situation in Libya, should be kept in our mind during the discussion about a very interesting book, an exciting book, which I would consider an essential reading for all those dealing with Libya in a professional way, and furthermore, for all those simply interested in the destiny of a wonderful country. My special welcome is to Mr. Jason Beck, the author of the book, and our distinguished panelists, Ambassador Deborah Jones, United States, Ambassador Ibrahim Dabbashi from Libya, and High Commissioner Arthur Snell from UK. My dear friend Jason is not only a great fan of the Philadelphia Eagles NFL football team like me, but also one of the premier experts on Libya and the author of the fascinating book, Libya and the Global Enduring Disorder. Jason is a consultant, author, and commentator with over 2 decades on experience living and working in the Middle East. He has advised not only at the United Nations and NATO, but most Western governments on formulating policy towards Libya. Jason is the founder of Libya Analysis LLC. He is currently a senior analyst for emerging challenges at the NATO Defense College Foundation in Rome, and an associate fellow of the Henry Jackson Society in London. Jason, this is probably most interesting for us today, has just returned from a Libya trip where he was a delegate on the Libya British Business Council trade mission, and he had private meetings with several senior leadership of UNDP, of UNHCR, of the European Union in Tripoli, of the National Oil Corporation, and the Central Bank of Libya. Before handing over to Jason, I would encourage everyone in the audience to send us your question to our distinguished experts. Please join in with your questions and make our discussion, our event, more lively. Jason, up to you. Could you please introduce your book and explain especially its relevance for the current global political order or disorder?
Wow, thank you, Wolfgang, for such a warm welcome, and good morning to everyone in the States. Good afternoon to those in Europe. Masal khair, l'jamia fi sharq al-awsat. Thanks to the National Council for the US-Libya Relationship for hosting and promoting this event. Although the world system is facing the gravest interlocking geopolitical crises in our lifetimes, it gives me a lot of solace to be speaking to a community of like-minded individuals and friends, and to feel that I'm doing my small little piece by being able to share my research and touch on my experiences from my most recent trip in Libya, which I just returned from on Saturday. Little did we know when I conceived the volume that we have here in 2019, that its central concept, i.e. of the world being in a new era of enduring disorder, would become a widely accepted truth within a 3-year period. My book takes aim at the core shibboleths in the field of international relations. In fact, I argue that conventional realist IR analyses of the kind associated with, say, Richard Haas, cannot explain the current Ukrainian and Libyan crises. They miss a key dynamic. IR theory posits that states try to maximize their interests in a rational way. Yet this approach fails to explain core dimensions of how either Ukraine or Libya has gotten to its present moment. Yes, Russia has certain economic and ideological interests in Ukraine, like keeping it in the Russian trading bloc, or protecting Russian speakers, or increasing the size of the Ruski Mir, or preventing NATO expansion. But none of these so-called rational interests actually capture why Putin has done what he's done. and why leaders like Orban, Trump, Imran Khan, Bolsonaro, Raisi, and other neo-populists inherently support the current war or feel that they stand to gain from it. Now, if we look at Libya, we can see similar dynamics. The Turks, Russians, Emiratis, Qataris, French, Italians, Americans, Brits, Egyptians, all inadvertently or advertently prolong the crisis in the country, though a solution and compromise would boost all of their economies and help all of their interests. So truly no one, and especially not the Libyan people, win from the prolonged impasse in Libya. I think that this highlights that conventional IR theory cannot explain these complex multipolar standoffs. And it also doesn't explain why status quo actors engage in what I call incumbent psychology. So to look at these collective action problems, I think we need a new approach, a new, shall we say, paradigm. So when I was in the meetings that Wolfgang alluded to with Western ambassadors or the head of UN or EU bodies in Libya last week, I have to convey the rather pessimistic note that no one spoke about the likelihood of elections in the next 6 to 12 months. And when I mentioned, well, what if we give the Libyans tough love in a way that could push them to undertake the economic reforms that would be in everyone's best interest and could propel us out of this situation? Essentially, although they didn't use the term the enduring disorder, these senior diplomats described the situation as a chaotic equilibrium, which serves no one's interests, but which for a range of game theory calculations, lack of trust among different actors, and the psychological aspects of incumbents, it's unlikely to resolve. And this, to me, gives us a lot of insights into the world system. It, in fact, leads us to the primary contention of my book, which is that key conflict nodes of the global system, again, like Ukraine and Libya, but we could also say Syria, Yemen, maybe some others, they're destabilized by this lack of coherent collective action in the world system. But then the more that they stay as key conflict nodes, they emit further disordering contagion into global geopolitics. And the key actors, not only neo-populist leaders like Putin or Boris or Trump or the jihadis or major Fortune 500 companies who are de facto monopolists acting to protect market niches rather than maximize profit, that this gets at the key feature of the enduring disorder, which is these negative feedback loops. No one can collective action together, so we have nodes of conflict, and then the nodes of conflict emit further disorder. In short, I see issues like climate change, tax havens, civil wars, and state implosions like those of Libya, Ukraine, and Syria as all similar types of foreign policy challenges, because they're all fundamentally collective action challenges. So the Libya conflict is no different than climate change. It requires robust international agencies and solutions to enforce penalties and to essentially, herd cats. And it's this realization that has led me to partner up with the Henry Jackson Society and the NATO Defense College Foundation in Rome to launch a program with the modest goal of elaborating a unified field theory of global affairs, explaining why the post-Cold War era is over, while also presenting a possible prism to unpack how the United States and Russia are in a much more overt and existential confrontation than even at any time during the Cold War. This ensuing program, NATO and the Global Enduring Disorder, and the podcast that it will launch, hope to move beyond the standard academic and think tank problematization and towards proposing solutions and opportunities for collaboration that represent the low-hanging fruit of how we can exit the enduring disorder. Okay, so all this begs the question, why Libya? Why does Libya give us particular insights into the state of the world? I conceive Libya as a useful microcosm for understanding international developments and collective action failures more broadly, and therefore I can marshal Libya-specific research to make these larger points. For me, the country presents a natural case study for explaining the new constellation of geopolitical dynamics, which I term the enduring disorder, and which I assert has supplanted the post-Cold War order. In fact, I argue that Libya in 2011 was the first petri dish where all the features of the enduring disorder were present. They then later manifested themselves in Syria, Yemen, and Ukraine, and now pretty much everywhere. We live the enduring disorder when we watch our midterm election returns in the States, and we live the enduring disorder when we have a prime minister who served for 44 days and was kicked out essentially because the very markets that she thought were God tanked her mini budget. This approach of looking to Libya first to explain new phenomenon in the international arena is actually a highly unoriginal approach. From time immemorial, Libya has been the birthplace of novel phenomena. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle wrote in his Historia Animalium, Libya always brings forth something new. And today, possibly more than any other territory on earth, the slow-moving conflict over Libya mirrors the absence of global order and the failure of the major powers and global organizations to provide it. Why is this? Why do medium powers like Turkey, the UAE, and Russia have far more ability to project power into Libya than the economic juggernauts, the US, EU, and China? And by the way, that's certainly what I see in the ground. It's Turkey who chooses to switch its support from Bashaga to Dubaiba. It's Turkey who will decide if Haftar can ever make another play or not. And it's the Emiratis who are able to guarantee that their candidate, Farhad bin Gadara, is the one who stays in the NOC chairman's office. It's not the US's candidate or the Chinese candidate who's in at NOC. It's the Emirati candidate. And it's the Turks who provide the essence of the security situation that mitigated those August clashes. I mean, we had a very scary breakout of violence in August of this year, but it only lasted 2 days because since the 23 October ceasefire of 2020 that Stephanie Williams arranged, we've not seen major clashes because the Turks make sure that there is not intra-militia and inter-militia rivalry in Western Libya that can escalate into a conflict. It's not a US or a Western guaranteed order in Libya, it's a Turkish guaranteed order. How has this novel phenomenon come about? I would assert it's because neither the Chinese or the US perceives its own core interests threatened enough in Libya to order the international system in such a way that conflict zones like Syria or Libya are contained. Conversely, the EU perceives its core interests and ideological positions as very existentially threatened by developments in Libya, Syria, or Ukraine, as well as over climate change, but is unable to coordinate disagreements to formulate a coherent response because the French are on one side and the Italians are on the other. And the Germans wanted to have one way of dealing with Putin in the lead up to the Ukraine conflict, and the British and French wanted a different response. So these collective action failures and lack of hegemonic leadership have been manifesting themselves right from the collapse of the Gaddafi regime in 2011. And the major European players were tugging in different directions, suspecting each other's motives, clients, and actions in Libya. I show in my book, and certainly my conversations in Libya last week highlighted that the last 12 years of policy towards Libya showcase that the major Western nations have acted out the ancient Bedouin proverb, me against my brother and I against my cousin, my brother, my cousin, and I against the outsider. This proverb evokes the structure of an archetypical peninsular Arab or even Eastern Libyan tribe composed of equivalent mutually opposed segments. The founder of social anthropology and renowned historian of Libya, E. Evans Pritchard, dubs such tribes segmentary. Ironically, during the enduring disorder, the famous proverb has come to apply to the ineffective Western efforts at foreign policy coordination. It also encapsulates the post-2016 retribalization of our politics and culture in many Western societies, and the inability of narrow factions to put aside petty feuds and focus on shared interests until forced to do so by existential threats. Looking at developments in Libya really highlights how this microcosm has played out over the last 2 decades. The US and UK work together on a lot of things, but the French and Italians don't until they're forced. The Benelux countries can work together with the Scandinavians, but only with the larger Europeans, again, when the existential threat is so great. We can see this in the Ukraine confrontation. In the lead up to it, the Germans were not really willing to say that they were on board for tough sanctions during the Russian troop buildup in January of this year. And I blame Olaf Scholz for appearing to dither about whether he would close Nord Stream 2 or his statement that he would initially prevent Baltic countries from re-exporting German arms to Ukraine. And of course, because he wasn't on the same page, it was only once the conflict began that the Western brothers and cousins chose to effectively coordinate, because the scary big bear of an outsider existentially threatened them. And the Zeitenwende was a response to the extent to which the German people were way out in front of the German leadership. So you might say, wait a second, this isn't novel. Hasn't policymaking always been comprised of reversals and tug of war and competitions among power centers? Well, for me, the post-2011 chaos in the international scene appears to differ not only in degree, but actually in kind from what came before. Not only is the international system unmoored due to the lack of Anglo-American hegemonic leadership for the first time in 2 centuries, but this is something which we need to realize predated the Trump administration. It predated Brexit, and it's because major powers have failed to create suitable coordination mechanisms to deal proactively with the new kinds of collective action problems presented by the 21st century. I argue that the current world system is not characterized by the multipolarity of previous eras of competition, like World War I, the interwar period, or World War II, eras in which each aspirant to power strove to order and expand its own sphere of influence. Today, we are faced with a new era of deliberative disorder. We see this very clearly with the ongoing and likely semi-permanent struggles surrounding Ukraine and Libya. In this era, major international players actively undermine global order, eschew collaboration, and block knowledge accumulation. Today's ascendant powers like Russia, China, Brazil, and Turkey may not be concerned with ordering or balancing the international system or even their regional spheres. Libya's chaos interacts with the fallout from the COVID pandemic and illustrates crucial facets about the current state of the world. The political implications of globalization of a particular form of neoliberal capitalism, which just at the moment of the supreme American victory during the Cold War eschewed institutionality. It was this neoliberal ideology, or almost religion, which said we can just let the market sort it out and we don't need to embed institutions in dealing with how states and new economic drivers are contained. To my mind, like a funhouse mirror, the closer we look at Libya, the more we see the salient dynamics of the wars of post-Gaddafi succession, reflecting selective distortions of crucial features of the international system and the post-pandemic world. In Libya, as elsewhere, we simultaneously have more of a need for global collective action than at ever before. And ironically, we have less coordinated global collective action than at any time in modern history. You might say that the Ukraine conflict bucks that trend, but I think it doesn't, because although Ukraine is likely to win, it's going to be an American and British response and not a coherent European one, which catapults them to victory. So will multipolarity or rebalancing of powers automatically come about because of the decline of America's relative power? No, I don't think so. Just as the ensuing power vacuum in Libya in the wake of Gaddafi's ouster has not by some cosmic Newtonian law elicited the creation of a new durable organizing force to fill the void, nor has it incentivized a dominant outside power to provide order. There are various indicators that the world has become increasingly Libyanized by becoming thoroughly penetrated by the key features of the enduring disorder: incumbent psychology and collective action failures. So developments in key nodes like Libya, Syria, or Ukraine produce and emit the violence, hot money, ideology, media polarization, and culture wars and migrants that feed the spiral into further disorder. We're no longer living in the post-Cold War world. Welcome to the enduring disorder. So I can stop here, Wolfgang. I have some more to say about why collective action is so elusive in today's world and the role of China and Russia, but let's come to that later in the Q&A so we can have more time for our panelists.
Excellent. Jason, I appreciate very much your statements about the lack of coordinated collective action, because I think this is one of the key problems, not only for Libya, but exactly as you've outlined, also in several other parts of the world. With regards to Ukraine, I would add at least Poland to the United States and to UK as key supporters. But you're right, with regard to financial contribution and so on, the US is, of course, currently again leading the way. I would like to introduce High Commissioner Arthur Snell. He is a British author, a political commentator, and a former diplomat. He is a graduate from the prestigious University of Oxford in history, worked at the Foreign Commonwealth Office in London, held thereafter several diplomatic postings in exciting countries like Zimbabwe, Nigeria, Yemen, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So I think, Arthur, you wanted to try all of these key crisis areas, and this is why we are discussing with you now about Libya. Thereafter, he was appointed as the United Kingdom's High Commissioner to Trinidad and Tobago. This is the equivalent of an ambassador. Arthur later left the government service and is now Managing Director of Orbis Business Intelligence, a risk consultancy. Arthur, I would like to ask you to give your first statement and include also what drives from your point the British policy over Libya and how constant is it since 2011?
Well, thank you, Wolfgang. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, obviously, to Jason for generating this opportunity and for his wonderful book, which I had the pleasure of reviewing a little while ago now. So I come to this not as a Libya specialist, although someone who has worked in the Middle East, someone who is familiar with the Arab world, and of course, somebody who has been involved in British foreign policy throughout the period under reference. My own work more recently as an author looks at Britain's diplomatic and foreign policy experience over the past quarter century. And in that context, I think we can see Libya from a British perspective as one of a succession of crises where Britain failed to learn from history, failed to learn from its own mistakes, and then failed to plan for success. And it's very notable if you just think of the case study of David Cameron, who in 2010 was elected as our Prime Minister on a platform in part of drawing a distinction between the example of Tony Blair and the New Labour era and the interventionism of Tony Blair's era. And David Cameron very clearly saying that we're, the nation building activity was a thing of the past. And within one short year of becoming Prime Minister, he was leading a regime change operation in Libya. Now, of course, there's a lot of complexity and detail to that history, but it's just an interesting case study of how quickly Britain found itself repeating something that it had done in Iraq only 8 years earlier, and arguably with very, very little success. To answer your first question, the consistency of British policy, well, I think there's been very little consistency, and Britain got occupied on the Libya file very early, arguably with a very limited understanding of what was at stake. And I had a small role in some of that. I was briefly working inside the equivalent of our National Security Council staff at that time, was witness to the excitement and adrenaline that goes with a country engaging a military action. Britain's Air Force, of course, with allies, France notably, and others, was active in the air over Libya. But very little engagement with the history of Libya, very little engagement with the underlying challenges of a country that had an almost uniquely dysfunctional government during the Gaddafi era, and which was therefore perhaps ill-suited to a fast regime change operation of the sort that was rapidly being envisaged. But to try to, I'm not going to spend a long period of time talking, because there are many others who need to have their opportunity here, but try to characterize British policy on Libya as we come forward up into this year. What you see, it's a very, very reactive policy. And of course, for a long period of time, British policy on Libya was being run remotely. We didn't have an ambassador on the ground for several years until the return of our ambassador actually this summer in the middle of the year, so in June. So that was a positive step. But we have a very reactive policy where we see the emergence of new actors on the scene. And this was very much the case with the emergence of General Haftar. Countries that have had a closer and more nuanced engagement with Libya may have had good or bad reasons for engaging with Haftar. I think the British reasons were really rather weak. They were simply that from a perspective of minimal engagement and little understanding of the situation, we saw someone who we briefly thought might have been a way out of our difficulties in Libya, briefly found ourselves gradually approaching, and of course Boris Johnson had his meeting with Haftar in 2017, and then of course we sort of came to our senses. We saw that he was a rebel leader supported by a Russian mercenary unit, and that it's not that he has no place in the Libya of the future, but it is very dangerous to be picking sides in this very complex, multifaceted conflict. One of the things, just to try to get to where we are in Britain's Libya policy now in November 2022, in a way I should defer to Jason, who's only just returned. But something that I did notice was two perhaps slightly contradictory elements, which I think reflect a country, Britain, whose foreign policy structures are currently now completely dysfunctional. If you consider that we have we're on our third prime minister in as many months. We have very little confidence. The civil servants in our country have very little confidence in the political leadership. So people are extremely reluctant to engage in risky or ambitious policy objectives. And we are still grappling with unresolved issues, particularly around Brexit and the Northern Ireland border question. So that's all there. And then you add to that, of course, the overwhelming responsibility of the Ukraine crisis. So I note just a couple of interesting facts. One is that in October, Britain hosted, and I think this was a sensible idea, hosted a small low-key conference in the UK, away from London, bringing together core allies to discuss Libya and the ways forward. I don't think any radical new policy objectives came out of that. It's clear that we need to support the UN and the UN process. But the other thing I noticed was that Britain's new ambassador had a meeting with General Haftar in October, was photographed with him. But this photograph will not be found anywhere on British government websites, but is on the General's website. So this strikes me as a kind of naivety and an inability on the side of the British to grapple with either the realities of what's happening in Libya or actually to decide where it wants to be. We want to have these meetings, but we don't want to admit to having them. And then finally, of course, rather as Britain has followed a kind of neo-Trumpist populism in its foreign policy, you'll see that there's a pay-to-play element in our foreign policy. What do I mean by that? I mean the fact that Fatih Ben-Shaga's main London lobbyist was also double-hatted as the chief of staff of the brief Prime Minister Liz Truss. So Mark Fulbrook was the chief lobbyist and was also chief of staff of the Prime Minister. And that's very reminiscent of the era when Jared Kushner had a sort of both an economic function as an investor developing his own and family interest in the Gulf region, but was also the chief foreign policy player for the Trump regime. So I think that speaks to the chaotic inadequacy of Britain's current policy, both in Libya and more broadly. And that's where I'll conclude these brief remarks. Thank you.
If I could jump in there, Arthur, sure. As always, very cogent and as uplifting and doomsday watching as I could imagine. I want to say about Britain's convening role over the 12 years post-Gaddafi. In the early years, the British were really good at convening. One, because Cameron personally was vested in Libya. It was you break it, you own it. And he took it really seriously, right? And Britain differs from other European powers in that it has the core equities with all the players, with Qatar, with the Emirates, with Egypt, with Saudi. with China, with Russia, in a way that only the US does. Not even France has all the core equities with the players. And then the Libyan diaspora that, has money and skills is here in the UK, in Nottingham, in Manchester, in Edgware Road. So there was a convening role. And then you hit the nail on the head. Brexit just knocked Britain for 6. And there was not capacity to focus on non-European questions. The convening role disappeared. It dropped off the agenda. So even this Wilton Park conference that you mentioned, it was an afterthought. And I think the analogy of Liz Truss's chief of staff lobbying for Fathi Bashagha to, Jared Kushner's influence on Trump is what I term in the book shadow policy. And I just wanted to jump in here to unite Britain to the global enduring disorder. Britain internally is now experiencing the global enduring disorder. The pound fluctuates wildly, and British policy is not something that technocrats dream up in storied Whitehall buildings. Rather, there is a shadow policy where the friend of the current guy who's in power conducts a thing not through the official Foreign Office channel. And those meetings with Bashagha were not Foreign Office approved meetings. They were meetings that Mark Fulbrook had without notifying the Foreign Office, which is truly Trumpian. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I have a phone call with Haftar, but I didn't run it by State Department. So we are living the enduring disorder equally in Whitehall, as in Foggy Bottom, as in Tripoli, as in Benghazi. So I think that your remarks really capture that texture. And it also takes away any moral high ground. How can Britain or the US bang heads together in Libya when we're not even able to have consensus in our own societies about some of these core questions? I mean, it's very difficult to imagine how would British leadership and convening of the reconstruction phase play out now. I can't see it.
Indeed.
Yeah, very good points. Arthur, before I let you go, I would like to ask you also, based on your experience as a former European diplomat, as you have been abroad, the UK was still a member of the European Union. What would you say? How defunct is the European Union's foreign policy? Is it the same like with UK? And what could the Europeans realistically do to contain the enduring disorder? You have a special view on this. You were once inside and now you are outside. So what would be your advice?
Yeah, well, I think the one thing I would say is that actually the European Union, its foreign policy is undoubtedly severely challenged, it's severely limited, but I think it's arguably the case that it actually is more advanced now than it's ever been. And if we just think, for example, about the so-called European Peace Facility, Europe is now purchasing lethal weapons at the European level, not at the individual bilateral nation state level, in order to support one side in an ongoing conflict. Now, of course, many of those listening to this webinar might say, well, that's uncontroversial, but it's still quite challenging. At the beginning of the Ukraine war, as Jason very eloquently summarized, there was a lot of uncertainty. Germany had to have its Zeitenwende in order to reach the point we're at. There were question marks around Italy's commitment to supporting Russia. And we still have within the EU, in Hungary, basically a Russia supporting cuckoo in the nest, if you like. Now, the challenge, of course, what you have with the EU is an emerging state. Now, that might be a controversial statement. It's certainly controversial in the UK context, where there is a fear of Europe as a superstate. But it is easy to see, if you take a long-term historical view, the institutions of a state very, very slowly and gradually building in Europe. And of course, part of that encompasses a single currency, a single foreign policy. Eventually, we'll probably have a single defense policy. Now, those other elements, foreign and defense policy, are very complex and take time to come. And there will always be major players within the EU. And of course, Libya is a place where you see these major players rise with their personal and bilateral interests, Italy, France in particular, but to some extent, major countries in Northern Europe. But so I suppose to come back to your question, Wolfgang, and try to answer it succinctly, I think it is not correct to call it defunct. I think the policy may have become defunct in certain areas, and actually on Libya, it is pretty questionable. But actually, the enduring disorder, arguably in its Ukrainian manifestation, has actually focused the EU, has made it more coherent. And when I say more coherent, that's starting from a low base. So it's not going to look like America. It's not even going to look like the UK for all of the challenges that we've just described. The EU is still a huge entity encompassing nearly 30 countries with all kinds of divergent interests, geographies, economies, and so on. However, what we've seen in Ukraine is unprecedented. And once you've created those precedents, it then defines future action. So I think we are, in some respects, the European foreign policy has moved significantly in coherence in this year.
Thank you very much. Very good points. I would like to add, with regards to the European Union foreign policy, that this is somehow also a microcosm for a lack of coordinated collective action. But I would say this is somehow understandable. What is driving common action? It's driven either by a common enemy, Ukraine-Russia conflict, or it's driven by common interests. What is the common interest between Sweden and Portugal in Libya? Why should Portugal? That's the issue. So it's always about defining common interests. And this is a key challenge. I'm heading to Brussels tomorrow, and what I'm always telling the people in Brussels and the European politicians is, it's not necessary to establish a new rapid reaction force with 3,000, 5,000, 10,000, 20,000 troops. It's important to define the common interests and to decide where you can employ this rapid reaction force. At most times, 5,000 troops would be certainly sufficient. But as long as there is no common interest, no defined common interest within the European Union, other than promoting democracy, so talking about key security and key economic interests, it will be extremely difficult. Thank you for your inputs. I think this was extremely important for us to have someone from the non-European Union side to talk about this. Thank you.
Thank you.
If I could jump in on this question of common interest, I think that's a myth that there aren't common interests. Even Italy and France, who seemingly have different focuses on migration or counterterror, everyone would benefit from a stable Libya, which is exporting oil and which is producing 3 million jobs in the Mediterranean basin. If you have 1% difference, of course, you could fight over that 1% difference, but you've got 99% the shared interests. So,
exactly. And this is right now a common interest, somehow a common interest between the French and the Italians. It was quite different a couple of years ago when the French were even more engaged, and I'm looking forward to asking Ambassador Dabbashi about this, when the French were more engaged in the Sahel area, when they were more worried about Mali. They are still worried, but they're more or less out there. So the Sahel has now a rather lower priority for the French foreign policy for various reasons. This allows them to redirect the foreign policy in another way, which makes it easier to find a common ground. But Jason, you're perfectly right. That's the key point. Brings me to a very distinguished Libyan who had a key role, especially at the beginning of the Arab Spring in Libya, of the beginning of the Libyan revolution, to Ambassador Ibrahim Dabbashi. Welcome, sir. Ambassador Dabbashi is a senior Libyan diplomat. He was born in Sabratha on the west coast of Libya. He has a degree from the Al-Fateh University in 1974 and served formerly as a Libyan permanent representative to the United Nations in New York. In February 2011, he had a key role because he led the country's UN mission in opposing the continued rule of Muammar Gaddafi. And it could very well be that Ambassador Dabbashi is again playing an important role in Libya in the future, because I would say he's one of the leading candidates for the next Libyan presidential elections. Ambassador Dabbashi, looking forward to your statement. Please unmute your microphone.
Thank you, Wolfgang. My greetings to the participant and the audience. Thank you, Jason, for the brief on your book. And certainly, I hope that the internet will serve, because we have a very weak internet, especially in by night. So let me say that the main factors, the main three factors, which are the root cause of all negative developments that led to the current state of institutional and security chaos in which Libya has been living since the fall of the Gaddafi regime. These are the three. You are hearing me? Well, it seems that.
Yes.
You are hearing me? Okay.
Yes, loud and clearly.
Okay,
yes.
Good. So these three main factors. The first one, the first was the absence of a competent, charismatic leadership at the helm of power, capable of filling the vacuum left by Gaddafi and setting the way forward for a democratic, prosperous state. The second was a concession from the region's representatives at the General National Congress to the federal minority in the Eastern region to form the Constituent Assembly on the basis of the equal representation of the three historic provinces of Libya, following the example of the pre-independence one, whereby 20 members would be from Cyrenaica, 20 from Tripolitania, and 20 from Fezzan. This brought back the seed of division among Libyans and imposed the principle of equal representation of the three regions in all high posts, which led to a widespread administrative incompetence at all levels. The third was a concession from the government to appease the militias by putting its members on the government payroll and treating them as a de facto parallel security forces superior to the police force and the regular army units. These three main factors led to Libya being the victim of what Mr. Pax terms as enduring disorder. In fact, we saw incompetent previously and individuals leading institutions they had never been part of it before. Most of them have foreign citizenship and their families live abroad. They came for the money and they leave as soon as they lose their posts. See where the ex-prime ministers and ministers are right now. Some of them were greedy to power and willing to secure foreign support to stay in power or gain power at any cost, including making commitments against the Libyan long-run interests. In the absence of a strong, charismatic and competent Libyan leader, foreign powers who have been involved in the Libyan conflict in 2011 and others seemed prefer to see, not encourage, an enduring chaotic security and political scene. Each of them suffering to make sure that an emerging Libyan leader should advance their own interests. Competing powers made their choices among the Libyan divided authorities and lent them the support they need to stand against their adversaries. What made foreign military and mercenaries presence in Libya possible, and added to the complexity of solving the Libyan crisis. This selfish behavior perpetuated the institutional division and prevented consensus on critical issues among the Libyan competing authorities institutions. I do agree with Mr. Pak that some powers are profiting from Libya's descent into chaos. However, we should not spare anyone of those involved in the Libyan file, including the US and the UK. Let us say, in fact, most of freezed cash assets are in accounts at the banks of the US, the UK, and Belgium. As Libya cannot manage the accounts, all interests of these accounts, which is estimated at between $4 and $5 billion annually, go to the hosting banks. If we take into account that these assets have been used by the banks in trade and loans over the last 12 years, the figure will be multiplied at least 12 times. Imagine what will happen if an elected legitimate Libyan government was established and law and order were restored. Unfreezing assets will be a priority for any government to meet the multiplied financial challenges that will be a big to the banks and the host countries. So it is not, it is understandable that even the UK and the US may benefit from this chaos which is going on in Libya. Libya as a country is committed to the principle of the non-aligned movement. Any new legitimate government should state clearly that means cooperation for the mutual interest with all countries is welcome, but foreign military presence under any circumstances is unacceptable. No way out for Libya without free and fair presidential and legislative elections. The Libyan people should be the arbiter for any controversial issue. They should be consulted through referendum whenever consensus proved to be unreachable. The Libyan people should be fairly represented in all meetings, setting the rule for the Libyan way ahead. Comprehensive municipalities representation in a Libyan national dialogue is the only way to produce a binding document for all Libyans, forming an interim government before the elections. Strengthening multilateral cooperation institutions is the only way to end disorder and resolve international problems, including the crisis in Libya. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Very interesting points, and we will come back to some of your points during the discussion. But now I would like to turn to Ambassador Deborah Jones, who retired from the US Department of State in November 2016 with the rank of Career Minister, which is the second highest senior foreign service, equivalent to a 3-star general, after 30 years of service for the United States diplomacy. Ambassador Jones is a graduate from the Brigham Young University and also, very important, a distinguished graduate of the National War College, National Defense University with a master's degree in national security strategy. So she is perfectly posted to comment on the global disorder and on all the things we are discussing right now. Ambassador Jones was the principal officer at the US Consulate General in Istanbul, Turkey, so she is very well aware of the Turkish position and of the Turkish intentions and interests. She was the US ambassador to the state of Kuwait and, extremely important for us today, the US ambassador to Libya during a critical time for Libya, from June 2013 until September 2015. Her last assignment was Deputy Commandant of the Dwight D. Eisenhower School for National Security and Resources Strategy at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Jones, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. And it's so nice to see you again, Ambassador Dabbashi. I think it's been a number of years, 9 years perhaps, since we met in New York. And thank you, Jason, for your book, which is fascinating, and it's on so many levels. I hardly know where to begin. As I say, I only hope it was therapeutic for you, and it makes me realize I probably need to write my own story of what happened while I was there. And I don't want to spend too much time, but I do want to on the book, on the larger idea, because I think we'll probably have a lot of questions on Libya, but let me offer a few thoughts about the enduring disorder and where we are now. I think historically, politics is always behind technology. Politics is organic, technology is revolutionary. Politics is evolutionary. And we have seen throughout history these moments of disruption where world order is thrown on its head, whether through expanding literacy, or I think even Walter Bajot said, democracy as it expands is actually going to lead precisely to this kind of chaos. And I must say that I came away after leaving Libya and thinking about something that a very wise Libyan told me. He said, the challenge here, Deborah, is that we are both very, we're fragmented and we're networked. And at the time, I don't think I appreciated the extent of that challenge until I look now at American politics and what has happened, because we are very fragmented and we're heavily networked. And that has led to what my older daughter I think 5 years ago said, Mom, we are the victims of electron tribes right now. And these electron tribes that flow and ebb and bring up differences divide us and unite oppositions and make it very, very difficult to govern. And I would say that in Libya was very much that way because, and you have a chapter in your book, Jason, very much on the social media platforms. And I know that firsthand because we were the first to use Twitter there. And I learned soon on that the ambassador has to absolutely control the Twitter messages and not the ambassador's staff, which can lead to a lot of problems. But I did want to say in terms of the hegemon and the role of the hegemon, and we have these kinds of, I think, almost nostalgic notions about what it means to be a hegemon, because in fact, as you look at empires, and you have cited various empires in your book, part of the appeal of the Roman Empire, for example, was that people wanted to be Romans. They wanted to be under the protective umbrella. They wanted to be included in that Pax Romana. The same thing with the Ottoman Empire, since you've raised Turkey, Wolfgang. But the Ottoman Empire provided a lot of protection to people in return for a tax. And people needed that kind of order and that protective, that security umbrella in order, and they functioned with that until they reached a point where they no longer wanted or needed it. And I'm just going to throw in here that I think in a funny way, the world has evolved in a positive sense. I mean, the Pax Americana post-World War II was highly artificial in many ways. We had so much, 40%, I believe it was, of the world's economy was controlled by the United States. And people often point to Japan and Germany as these examples of rebuilding and what you can do when you have a strong hegemon. But in fact, the reality is that these were two cultures that had strong cultural, institutional proclivities. And in fact, they were destroyed in technically, or industrial or what have you. But in fact, the cultures were there already prepared. They had someone who could surrender for them. In the case of the Japanese, there was such order and discipline there. And in the case of the Germans, they had already shown after World War I that they could rebuild quite successfully, thank you very much, with a sense of nationhood and who they were. And I would also point out, Jason, anyone who's read World War I, and I was a student of history as well, but World War I and the U.S. and Britain, the British and the French in the Middle East, what a disaster! The two of them competing, even as they profess to be on the same side. And in World War II, the US and the UK competing, whether it was in North Africa or it was on the Arabian Peninsula. So these are not new tensions or dimensions or perfidies. But I also think you need a partner. It gets to my point too. And I appreciated, Ambassador Dabbashi, what you said about the absence of a charismatic leader. And I think this is the other part of this whole post-Arab Spring issue that, again, you know, the quiz for everyone is who led the revolution in Egypt? Who led the revolution in Libya? There was nobody. It was the cell phone. It was the electron, the freed electron, the electron libre that created these connections that led to overthrows. And I would say it was an overthrow. And Jason, we can have this long discussion another time, but about the whole physics, the physics of power and authority and statehood that Max Weber was so fond of citing, that you needed a monopoly on the use of force. You know, well, force or violence. Force is mass times acceleration. And the electron in the hands of the masses constitutes a compelling and overwhelming force for governments to deal with. So I will say that I think that was one of the issues that we were dealing with. Let me go down now to the Libya level. You know, it is often quoted and it's often taken out of context. What Barack Obama, when he had his interview and he said, one of my biggest failure, you have to look at it the context. He said, my biggest failure was, I believe, and it was an easy toss away for him, was to say we didn't have a plan for the day after overthrowing Gaddafi. It was not after Chris Stevens was killed or anything else. It was, we didn't have a plan for Libya, because I think many people thought, and I was very, I don't want to be, well, I do want to be critical. My marching instructions, let me tell you, when I came out to Libya, there was so much political hoo-ha in Washington that, in fact, I was called 2 weeks after Chris died and asked if I would go out to Libya. That was in October of 2012. But because of the domestic and the political, because politics is local, and this gets back to the enduring disorder and European unity, et cetera, over Libya, all politics is local. American politics made it very difficult for us to engage in certain ways. And my hearings were held off because of the worry about the domestic backlash or the questions that could come up because of what was going on in Washington. But in fact, when I got out there, I had two sets of marching orders, basically. A, don't let Libya fall into the Syria column, quote unquote, from my chain of command. Secondly, Deborah, how hard can it be? 6 million people and 1.2 million barrels of oil a day, no brainer. And my reply was, sir, and it was not to the president, I will say that, sir, with all respect, you take an orphan with a trust fund and no wealth manager, and you put him in a bad neighborhood, and what do you think is going to happen? And I think we all saw what happened, and in many ways, and what has happened. I've been so impressed with the passion and the commitment to Libya of so many people who went during what I call the opening, the opening in 2006, 7, 8, etc. I've been it's been heartening and also sorrowful to see the great hope that people continue to have, and yet all the divisions that were already there. Even before I got out to Libya, people trying to pull one way or the other on where we go. But I did want to say that I do think the fragmentation, Jason, I agree with you 100%. Although I do want to clarify something. When I was there was the lead, the line was the UN has the lead. UNSMIL had the lead, and we were there to support it. And so there was a natural coalition of Security Council ambassadors, which we call the P3+1 because of Italy's place. And we did coordinate very, very deeply. And I know you mentioned the EU ambassador coming in, and I will say, in fairness to the EU ambassador, she actually presented herself at the US Embassy compound at my reception, and she said, I need to be part of that group. And there was a lot of coordination on the policy side, but you had foreign ministries that agreed across the board. At this time, Le Drian was with the Defense Ministry in France. You had intelligence services that agreed and were cooperating across the board. And you had defense departments that were collaborating and agreeing across the board. And then you had, again, local interests. As I say, politics is local. The Italians had an existential relationship with Libya, and they still do, because of their reliance on the energy that comes out of Libya. The British had a different historic relationship. The Turks have an historic relationship and a commercial relationship. You know, the French had their counterterrorism issues in the sub-Saharan that involved Libya. And all of these things, and the Americans, I mean, some of our agencies, one of our agencies in particular, had an interest in counterterrorism that kept them neutral on the topic of a certain general. Let me just leave it that way. So we found ourselves, yes, absolutely, evolving in this world where the foreign ministries were very tightly coordinated and working on things, and it went nowhere because there were different views on where we should go on these things. You know, again, I don't want to get too far into that, but I think that underscores where things fragment and fall apart in coming in. Having said that, I will also say, though, unless you have a receptive partner, and this gets back to Ambassador Dabbashi's point, you can bring all your game in. And I laughed in your book when I saw the quote you had from one of our colleagues about infrastructure and providing institutional support, which is funny because one of my first messages back to Washington, or one of the first three, was, you know, we come with all this institutional scaffolding saying we're here to help, and there's an institution of toothpicks on the other side. And, you know, and so we collapse them because they're not capable of receiving. And if you don't have that, you can have a policy, you can have Jim Baker going to Madrid and Bill Clinton inviting Yasser Arafat, you know, to talks. But if you don't have a partner who's able to play, you're not going to go anywhere either. And I think that that's been the other side. Ambassador Dabbashi, I'm curious, I would be curious when we hear later. I thought two of the things that I inherited when I arrived in Libya, and this is, I take a slap at the international community for this. When the Political Isolation Act was imposed on the representatives by militias, there was not a peep from the international community that I'm aware of, not a peep. And when I got there, it was a fait accompli. And the same thing, you know, the idea for this general purpose force to help that Ali Zaidan had asked for. I am told, whether this is true or not, that idea was actually put in his ear by a Western diplomat. I have yet to ascertain whether that's the truth or not. I'm not sure anyone would actually admit to it at this point. But that thing distracted and took people off and was basically building a militia for Ali Zaidan, or I don't know, that's what some people saw it as. The US could never buy into that because we were so busy trying to be paid for it. Another idea, another part, Jason, of the enduring disorder, you know, within the president saying he wanted something, the military saying, no, we don't want to do that, but kicking that can down the road to not be able to do that. So I would just as soon, I'm happier, I think, to take specific questions and to hear some of those things, because I think Jason is onto something. I do think there are answers out. I think they're local answers. I think they are municipal answers. I think there has to be power that devolves. And I also just want to point out and would highly recommend, there's a recent book out on globalism versus regionalism economically, by a woman from the Council on Foreign Relations, even though you took a little bit of a swipe at Richard Haas earlier in your remarks, Jason. But in it, the author posits that, in fact, it's not globalism, capitalism, this global economy has actually been regional economies. And they've been very self-supporting, very good. NAFTA, you have the North America, which is Canada, the US, and Mexico, the EU, and then the Asia bloc. Not surprisingly, Africa, but also the Arab world and oil producers, Russia and others have not joined. I put Norway in a different category altogether, but have not formed an economic bloc that has actually benefited them in ways. And Libya, finds itself kind of so close and yet so far from a bloc that would support its interests as well and bring it in. I mean, I think that's part of the problem as well, and that it ends up being part of this competitive thing. But we could go on forever all over the place, but I'll stop there and let us go to questions and answers. Thank you.
Deborah, thank you very much for your fascinating insights. And I would like to pick up with the political isolation law was imposed by the militias, and there was not a peep by the international community. Jason smiles because he's aware I'm going to ask him about, what do you think? Why was there not a peep by the international community? Jason. Unmute, please.
Deborah is exactly right. That was a key lost opportunity. I think there were 3 or 4 others. One was the July 5th, 2012 decision that the July 7th, 2012 GNC election wouldn't be for the ability of the GNC to appoint the Committee of 60, that there would be a separate election for that. Without going through other missed opportunities, we're just talking about the political isolation law. It seems like the internationals were not coordinated among themselves. Clearly an act of Libyan sovereignty and of the August 2011 temporary constitutional declaration had been breached. And there was an opportunity to say that this law was not binding, this political isolation law. But I guess no one wanted to stick their head out in front and challenge the fact that the GNC and Mohammed Maghayrif had authority. I mean, I blame Maghayrif a lot here, is that he himself accepted it and stepped down. It was very, very weird, his role in that moment, because what he could have said is, I had a position in India under the Gaddafi regime, who I then later opposed for 20 or 30 years. How could you say that this law applies for me? I was one of the premier dissidents. But it's just a regular lack of leadership. And I want to tie this together with Deborah's extremely interesting points about hegemons. Hegemons don't always make the right decisions, and we can overly glorify the past, because obviously the British and American hegemonic periods were not monoliths. You pointed out all of those imperial struggles in the Middle East, and British and American feuds post Suez Crisis and during the Suez Crisis. So I'm not glorifying the past. I'm merely saying that you need to look at these things relatively. There is relatively less hegemonic leadership now than 20 years ago. And that is the lens through which, when key focal moments come, and it's like, well, the Obama administration doesn't know if it should assert itself because, this is more the Europeans' backyard, and then the Europeans aren't sure if they should assert themselves because without American convening power, it's not clear. And then we really have to defer to the Gulf states who have a lot of equities there. And I just want to get at the coordination complexity aspect rather than having a vision that, oh, we should let, dead white men run our institutions. That's not at all what I'm saying, Deborah. It's rather that the world has become so complicated, and you put this brilliantly, technology is revolutionary and politics is evolutionary. The problem is the technology is progressing at light speed, and we don't even have post-Cold War institutions. Let's start. We're going to win this war in Ukraine. I mean, I felt confident in March, and I feel really confident now. When you win a war, it doesn't matter if it's the Congress of Vienna or Versailles or after World War II, the San Francisco Charter, you have an opportunity to make new institutions. Sometimes you screw up and you make the wrong ones, like at Versailles, or people don't buy in. We're going to have a moment. There's got to be a peace settlement. And let's not be so narrow-minded to keep the coalition that we got together for Ukraine and only have it be for the post-Ukraine territorial settlement and do they get Crimea back or whatever. Let's have it deal with how to integrate post-Putin Russia into the international system. Let's have it be about how to deal with other conflicts, or maybe even things like tax havens, because clearly the tax haven issue borders on the oligarch issue, which borders on this Russia issue. Let's think big, because we have a coalition, and I could see it, when it is victorious, having a lot of opportunities to institutionalize this victory.
Great point. I would like to ask all of you to answer the next questions rather briefly, because we have plenty of questions from our audience and others which have arrived via Facebook, email, and also here in Zoom. So please be so kind and answer the questions that I'm now going to ask right now in a rather brief way. At first, Ambassador Dabbashi, there was much talk about the international community and what the international community should do or should not do in Libya, and when they should talk and coordinate with this and that. I would like to ask you, as a leading Libyan diplomat and also politician, what do you think? To which extent could the international community really enforce or lead to a solution for the stabilization of Libya? How much influence does the international community really have on the ground on the key Libyan actors?
Well, I think we need much more coordination, especially a united position among the permanent members of the Security Council. That's the key point, because as we passed, special representatives of the Secretary General tried to do a lot to help the Libyans get out of this crisis, especially during the period of Salama and Williams. I think both of them tried hard to get a solution for the Libyan crisis. Unfortunately, there is always someone who come out and encourage one party or the other to do something to spoil what they are doing. And in many cases, the Security Council was not united enough to take a position that will impose, let us say, sanctions or something which could help UNSMIL to go ahead with what they are preparing. So I think the main question or the main point is how we can enforce the position of the United Nations, especially its mission in Libya, to lead the solution process in Libya.
Very good points. I fully agree with you, especially keeping in mind that the new UN Special Envoy has just recently arrived. And I think that he has, if he receives sufficient support from the international community, a quite good chance to achieve a real progress on the ground. We will see. Jason has mentioned in his book quite frequently the Trump administration. Ambassador Jones, I would like to ask you, how much was the American foreign policy under President Trump driven by the principle of isolationism and the Jacksonian foreign policy tradition of non-intervention? And how much did this facilitate the global enduring disorder?
Okay, thank you. First of all, I want to say with all respect, Donald Trump is not Xi Jinping, Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has a sense of history. He leads the country, and what he's doing because he thinks it's for his country's good. And I would even put, for all of his foibles, I would put Recep Tayyip Erdogan in the same category. Donald Trump is a self-absorbed narcissist. I have had colleagues and friends argue to me that he was a Jacksonian without knowing he was a Jacksonian. I don't buy it. I don't think he has any sense of history. I think he has a sense of I think Jason put it in the book, Trump likes a winner. I think someone whispered in his ear that a certain general was a winner. And he likes, doing deals with winners and making money. And he also, let us not forget, and I don't want to point too close a finger, but one of his closest advisors was Tom Barrack. Tom Barrack had ties not only to the Gulf, but during the Golden Promise era, I call it, the 2006 to 2011, when American businessmen were going to sleep with visions of dollar sugar plums in their heads, over all this business in Libya. I was told, at least by a prominent Libyan businessman, that Tombarak was his colony capital was one of the groups that was looking at the Libyan Investment Authority and handling a lot of its investments in the United States. So my point is distortions, easy wins, a business deal, a hotel on the beach. Donald Trump was not aware of any kind of policy other than Donald Trump and saying what fed people. He was the worst kind of populist, in my opinion, because I don't see any coherence. Jared, I'm not happy that he, was giving his son-in-law all of these roles and positions in government, but Jared at least had a cogent, you could understand where Jared was headed on his strategies. He was headed to, for Israel's acceptance in the region, leading to business in the region. Okay, I may not agree with all of that, but I can at least understand it. It's coherent. Donald Trump's was so incoherent. And I think if anyone who, look, I've said to people, both our friends and our enemies should read John Bolton's terribly written book, but very revealing book. It's just difficult to read because it's just but read it because it says everything about Donald Trump you ever needed to know. I say enough.
Thank you very much. Very clear points. I would like to turn now again to Jason with a question from the audience. Jason, will a federal or a confederal system solve the problem in Libya? And is separation an option if things get even worse between the three regions and the Libyans can't solve the differences? So what do you think about federalism or separation?
Sure. I mean, it's funny to have been asked this question no fewer than 100 times over the last 10 years. But let me say, firstly, how much fun I've had being on this panel, both with you, Wolfgang, and Ambassadors Jones and Dabbashi. Makes me smile to see all these good interplays. And I was at a meeting at an embassy in Libya where I wanted to remember your statement, Deborah, that instead of égalité, fraternité, et liberté, it should be transactionalism, fluidity, and what? Remind me again? Fluid,
transactional, and opportunistic.
I was close. Fluid, yes. And of course I quoted you and gave you the credit. That's how I'm going to answer this question of federalism. When federalists say, oh, it was great when we had federalism between 1951 and 63, it's like, no, it wasn't. The British wanted to have federalism as a way to let the Senussi govern the more populous area of Tripolitania and to prevent Egyptian-inspired Arab nationalists from coming to power in Tripoli. But the system worked so poorly that everything was vetoed, that as soon as you had an oil economy from the discovery in 59 and the export in 61, within 2 years of having an oil economy, it collapsed. Because you had people in Sabha vetoing things because they're like, no, we want this pipeline, we don't want this pipeline. So federalism will just more empower all the spoilers, the same militias that like, oh, we're going to cut the water or we're going to, cut this port and blockade it. Federalism didn't even work during the Federalist period. So that's why in 1963, not just Idris, but the whole country was very happy to move towards a degree of unity. I mean, people who think that it worked then have not read the history and they've not looked at the documents. So I don't think we're any closer to that. And I want to point this out. If you chat with people in Ashdabia or Sirte or in Ashkara, they don't want to be ruled by Benghazi. Benghazi is as far away from their reality as Tripoli is. What we have in Libya is a need for decentralization. And the formula that I've been talking about since 2012 that I learned from, the famous Libyans, Abdurrahman al-Ajali and Hamam al-Fezzi and Dr. Ahmed Jahani, which is a system of transparent flow of finances from a central authority to the municipalities, where each Libyan will have 1/6 millionth of the oil wealth in an inalienable right, and all financial flows being transparent. It's the standard, show me the money. And I'm never going to be able to match Deborah's witticisms, but I would say This is as good as I have. Show me the money. Transparency is the answer, not more layers of opaque governance.
Very interesting. Next question from the audience, snapshot question. Ambassador Dabbashi, what is from your point of view, what is Russia's goal in Libya? A key question for the European, a key question for the Americans. What does a leading Libyan say about what is Russia's real goal in Libya? What do they want to achieve?
Well, I think, during the Cold War, Libya, Syria, Algeria, maybe Iraq, they are considered pro-Soviet Union. And maybe even they are in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. So practically all of these countries are non-allied countries. All of them, they don't accept foreign bases or foreign military bases on their soil. But because of the armaments, etc., from the Soviet Union and the equipment of their arms from the Soviet Union, these traditional relations were stronger with the Soviet Union than with the United States and the Western countries. During the revolution and after, it is the Western unions, or the Western countries who came in assistance to the Libyan people. And practically and normally, these countries expect that after the revolution, they will have the privilege of more the priority of cooperation investments in Libya. So with this assumption, the Russians believe that, well, if they keep things go as normal and the government, full legitimate government will be in Libya, maybe they lose all the business that they have. It may even the arming of Libyan military forces will be armed by Western armaments, and they will lose a lot of money. It is business also now with the arms sale. And I think when they find someone who is against the central government in Tripoli, and he is willing to have any strong ally with him, they step in, and with the help of Egypt, and especially with Egypt, they managed to have good ties with General Haftar. And I think they want practically, but I can assure you that Haftar is not, I believe Haftar is not man. They are thinking about Saif al-Islam al-Gaddafi rather than Haftar. The plan for those generals who are with Haftar, once they arrive to Tripoli and get to the power, they will kick out Haftar and they will take over. And they usually, in their private meetings, they say Haftar is only a driver. He is the driver of the bus. Once we arrive to Tripoli, he will be kicked out and we will bring Saif and the old regime will come back. So I think this is the idea which is in the head of the leaders of and I don't think they are really faithful in supporting Haftar as their man. they are thinking about Saif al-Islam and the old regime always.
That's a very interesting point. Let's
Wolfgang,
talk enough.
oh, sorry, I just have to say, I have to confess to a sin in this regard,
Yes.
because, you know, because Russia had been supportive of the UN, you know, the whole actions on Libya and everything else in its own way, we actually, and when we were with, at the time, the then negotiator, this was after Tariq Mitri had departed, who, God bless him, Tariq understood Libya in many ways, I think, in a very good way. But we were talking one night in Tunisia about that when we had already engaged in Shirat, and I said, you know, we should probably try to bring as Security Council members the Russians and the Chinese on board, so that they're not outside, as L.B. Johnson said, you know, outside the tent making problems inside. You know, they are inside the tent with us on the other. So, in fact, and then the State Department approved it, and I went to Brussels in, I think it was sometimes in 2014, and I met with, it was Mikhail Bogdanov, who was then their guy for the Middle East, and we had a long discussion, and I extended the invitation on the part of all of us to join the Shirat dialogue. And of course, the Chinese sent a lot of people who said nothing, came one or two times. The Russians kind of came a little bit, and then the next thing we knew, we had Wagner Group, you know, playing in Italy or playing in Libya and dealing with our UAE friends. And I think the best definition of Wagner Group I have heard by someone, because it's been so cloaked in mystery, but it said a state leveraged illicit operation. Jason, I think that's a wonderful phrase for it. A state leveraged illicit operation. Sorry, Wolfgang, I'll shut up.
No problem. I was just about to ask you a question about another strong man, about Turkey's President Erdogan. And I'd like to ask you, what is Turkey's goal in Libya and in the Eastern Mediterranean?
Yeah.
Is Erdogan an agent of the global disorder? And
well, I know.
there's another question in which I would like to link with Turkey somehow.
Okay.
The question is, the politicians and UN envoys in Libya have focused on the west and on the east of the country. They don't care about the Libyan south.
Yeah.
Is this a mistake? And what is Turkey doing about the south? What are the Turkish intentions also about the south? A very complex question.
Yeah, it is a complex, and I'm afraid I'm not the right one to answer on the South. I know the French have always had the special relationship with the Fezzan.
Sorry, we'll hand over this question about the South to Ambassador Dabbashi thereafter. Please
yeah, we'll do Dabbashi on the South. On Turkey and Erdogan, look, you know, Turkey has a historic tie. It has historic ties to Libya. It has historic ties to Misrata, both blood ties, and it has extensive commercial ties. And like, you know, the Russians, like the US and like others, a lot of investment in construction and a lot of outstanding things in Libya. Add to that, you know, Erdogan's desire to be kind of at that time, the shepherd of Islam-oriented democracy. Let me put it that way. You know, so when Libya was transforming, this formed again part of that battleground. And Turkey and Egypt had their, you know, I've only once in my diplomatic career seen two diplomats literally go at each other's throats physically. And that was a meeting between two of our colleagues when we were at the UN one time. And they literally leapt across the table at one another, and we had to physically pull them apart because the feelings were so strong. Of course, all that's evolving now too. But look, Erdogan has genuine issues. You know, he is in the region. Again, politics is local. You know, he has gas and oil issues. I mean, he can see what was happening with the Greeks. And, you know, you heard the Turkish foreign minister's line. We have, however, X number of miles of coastline. Why are we relegated to tourism and Greece gets to exploit for oil and gas? Because, as you know, Turkey is oil and gas poor. And in fact, the US policy for years had been to help Turkey construct these pipelines to make Europe less dependent on Russia, on the former Soviet Union, for its energy supply. So I think in his own mind, look, there's as many reasons for Turkey to be in Libya as there are and more than for other groups to be there, such as, you know, some of our Gulf friends. So, you know, and in fact, I think, and even Stephanie Williams would say, had Turkey not stepped in to block Haftar's advance, dialogue would have been done with, and we would have gone into a bloody civil war, because we all know here that Tripoli would not have accepted Haftar's entry. And that would have been a huge disaster. And by the way, Jason, one of the most important, I wish I had thought about this before I went to Libya. Your line in the book about how Tripoli had gone through the revolution largely untouched, largely uninvolved, a lot of the Tripolitanians. But anyway, but yeah, so Turkey, look, I don't know that he's not a disruptor in the sense that Trump is, because there is a logic to what Erdogan does. And in the region, and he has millions of refugees. Turkey has a huge Syrian refugee population. I know Europe thinks it's a weapon, and Germany has, they have those ties and things, but those special fraught relationships. But the fact is, Erdogan's doing things there's a logic to him, and I can understand the logic, whether or not I agree with it always. Let me just put it that way. With Trump, I can't begin to see a logic even. Sorry, and I'll be.
It is for sure that there is certainly a logic behind the Turkish politics. I would like to stress that I also see very much a logic behind what his Minister of Defense, Hulusi Akar, is doing. I know him quite well because I worked for him in 2001 to 2003 in Naples, Italy, when he was the head of the J5 Plans Division. So the Turkish foreign policy is certainly very dedicated, and there is a plan behind it. Maybe agree or not. Ambassador Dabbashi, last question to you before handing over to Jason for some final comments about the South. From the audience, there was the question: the politicians and UN envoys in Libya have focused on the West and on the east of the country, and it seems to be they don't care about the South. What is your point? Who cares about the South of Libya?
Well, the South is really very important for the Libyan security. The problem that we have now in the South, the borders are open, and we have most of the population of northern Chad and northern Niger. They are moving into Libya. In the 90s, in the 80s, in fact, when we settled the problem of Aouzou, most of the population of the Aouzou Strip used to be considered Libyans before. They even have IDD cards, Libyan cards. But when the territory went back to Chad, the Libyans, I think the government made a decision that they should not have the Libyan nationality at the time. Practically, we gave them the territory. It should be with its population. This is the logic which has been in the government at the time. Unfortunately, this is a very poor region. Most of the population are moving in Sabha and in the other cities, especially they have their tribes, people from their tribes in our southern cities. And I think it is interested to the French, because it is there is a link between the Tuareg in Libya and the Tuareg in Mali. And there is a link between the Tobus in Libya and the Tobus in Chad and in Nigeria. It is a tribal link. It is a very strong, and it is very easy for those terrorists to move in between. So I think this is the interest for the French foreign policy in the past, and for the current situation. I think it is very difficult for either for the government in Tripoli or for General Haftar to control the territory and to make it safe for everyone. I saw whenever there is a high official going there, they have to make special measures to make it really safe, as we see now the Special Representative of Secretary General is in Sabha today. And I think that's a very good gesture from him. I hope that in the near future, something will have to be done about the South.
Thank you very much. Time is running, time is passing by. We are already almost at the end of our webinar. And as mentioned before, I would like to ask Jason, based on the title of the last chapter of his book, Quo Vadis Libya? And I would like to ask you also to give your outlook about the global disorder will develop. Please,
Well,
Jason.
Great questions, Wolfgang, and thank you so much for putting this together. Quo Vadis Libya. I want to say I just had this great trip. Peter Millett of the Libyan British Business Council and Susie Davis put on a great event. Libyans are getting more educated. They speak better English. The women are more involved in public life every time I go. There are places that you go in Damani or Nofilin. You can have pistachio cheesecake and have strawberry milkshakes. I walk around in the old city and it's been largely repaired where there were potholes in the Gaddafi period and the post-Gaddafi period. The potholes are now fixed. Absolutely no problem walking around Tripoli. You want to have a meeting at the central bank and you're staying in the Corinthia, don't drive, just walk. So there are like really good indicators in terms of like local stability, and I don't see a big war coming, okay? I just want to be clear. There's not going to be an internationally recognized prime minister, neither Dabaiba nor Bashaga. There's not going to be a third government. Aguila is going to block elections. But I don't see a big conflict or a bust-up coming. I think an oil blockade is much more likely. So when people say Quo Vadis Libya, the key thing to realize is that the compromise that got Ben Gadara in at the NOC may not hold. And if that compromise doesn't hold, Haftar and Aguila and the Eastern tribes will do an oil blockade. And of course, they're going to wait for winter when there's maximum pressure on the European economies and Ukraine fatigue and whatever. So oil blockade is my concern. That's the thing to be worrying about, not the security situation, not local, tiny little politics. And the only way to solve any of this is economic reform. You need transparency of the financial flows, show me the money, have the International Financial Commission, whereby the heads of all the semi-sovereign institutions convene an entity which sits with all of the Libyan sovereignty aggregated to it to reform these institutions so we don't have these subsidies issues and all these corruption issues. But about the enduring disorder, you know, long before Trump, we had this enduring disorder. And Deborah spoke very cogently about the chaos of the Trump period. In other words, we're not just talking populism, we're talking neo-populism, actively disordering because it has no vision. I said even before Joe Biden began governing that there were reasons to speculate that the world system could never return to the certitudes and alliance structures that characterized the Cold War and the early post-Cold War period. Long before Trump, NATO allies were not sharing information the way they once did. Diplomats were not committing their candid assessments to formal cables out of fear that they would be leaked, and disinformation was bouncing around cyberspace far quicker than the truth could get out of the starting blocks. So a study of coordination within the international system on the Libya file during the Trump years strikes me as indicative of many of the coordination failures that we are witnessing going forward in other policy domains, such as climate change and tax havens. I wrote the manuscript largely between February and June of 2020, and I predicted that either a Biden or a second Trump term would not allow the US to take leadership in Libya. The Russians could spoil progress at UNSMIL. The EU policies would remain poorly coordinated. Sadly, my predictions have come true. And therefore, it's critical to not blame Trump overly much or praise Biden too much. Neither the US nor the world system has returned to its post-Cold War policymaking dynamics. The international policy towards Libya illustrates this too vividly. We're stuck in the enduring disorder. We better accept the ensuing interconnections between the world's hotspots and seek to forge global collective action if we want to find ways out. That's to say that Libya, Ukraine, Iran cannot be solved in isolation when the drivers of disorders are left unchanged. So developments in places like Libya and Iran are symptoms of this disorder, not its root causes, which are in the collective action mechanisms and institutions. But we have a great movement. The Western world is largely united, although not the democratic world, because you have to keep in mind that India and a lot of Latin America is sitting out this Ukraine conflict, and I think to their eternal shame. But the Western world is at least united, and when the Western world is victorious, we have to allow the entire democratic world to claim that they have participated, and we should institutionalize. So when this Ukraine conflict, is over in, say, mid-23 or mid-24, we can't predict when it will be, there's going to be a great moment to try to create these new international governance and collective action institutions to work on other problems like post-Ayatollah Iran or tax havens or climate change. And I think it can be done, but we just have to accept that we're living in the enduring disorder. If we accept that, then we can try to find our way out. If we just try to firefight rather than deal with chronic and long-term problems, then we're always going to be firefighting with a whack-a-mole strategy. So I think that there's a note of optimism. We can do it. We can do it if we work with our friends. So it's been great to share this panel with some old friends like you, Wolfgang, and Ambassadors Jones and Dabbashi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jason. A rather dire outlook, but there is some hope on the horizon, I would say. Let me end with what High Commissioner Arthur Snell has sent to me as his final remarks. He wrote, "As a non-Libya expert, I featured a chapter of my book on British foreign policy, How Britain Broke the World, on the subject, because Libya feels like a case study in Western countries failing to learn from their own mistakes in Iraq and Afghanistan. This is not to say that these places are the same or even slightly similar, but we can make the same mistakes in different environments repeatedly." I agree with him. Another mistake that we can easily make, which I see now in late 2022, is the inability to walk and chew gum, or in this context, the inability to grapple with more than one complex crisis at one time. Absolutely correct. As Western attention rightly turns to Ukraine, I find myself asking whether we have time for political leadership to help stabilize Libya. I fear the answer is no. And the key role for containing or dealing with the global enduring disorder will certainly be with the next American president. We will know who it is in 2 years. Dear Jason, Ambassador Jones, Ambassador Dabbashi, thank you very much. Thank you very much for an exciting discussion, and all the best. Have a great day. Thank you to the audience. Goodbye.